All right, everybody, we're going to start with the Kahoot today, so you can start joining, and we'll get started right at 9. Alrighty, so everybody on Zoom, I'm screen sharing a Kahoot game, so please also join. This is gonna count as one of your in-class activity assignments. Would love to see some awesome engagement with it. So I'll give it another minute because I know sometimes it takes people a little bit to get signed on. I'm assuming y'all have done Kahoots before. They seem to be very popular in classes. But if you haven't, you just go to kahoot.it, or if you have the Kahoot app on your phone, you can just open it there. And then you enter in this game pin. And this is what will allow you to follow along. And we can also see who wins. So I'll give it another minute or so. While y'all are joining, just some reminders in terms of we're about a month out from the end of the semester, which is a little mind-boggling. I don't know if it is for y'all, but it is for me. So be making sure that you're doing your Connect assignments and the Explain It to the Media quizzes. We will have one more exam at the end of the semester. And then the other thing is to make sure you're turning in those assignments for your infographic project, because that's what's going to be during your final exam time. Yeah, Nyla. Exactly. And so I think, wait, let me double check on the syllabus before I lie to you guys. But yeah, what I'm gonna do is give you all the exam in class our last day, and then you'll bring it to the presentations to turn it in. So you'll have even like longer than usual. It's 8 a.m. on a Saturday. Are we all so excited? I have 3 exams that day, so I'm just gonna be here all day hanging out. Other folks on Zoom, please go ahead and join. And then exactly what Nyla just did, please ask me any questions you might have about assignments here. No, good question, Gabby. Everything for this class, as long as you turn it in, you're not going to lose points. I did not grade this weekend. I was hanging out with my family, but I will plan to catch up on grading very, very soon. And yeah, I will even replace zeros I've put in there. If you turn in the assignments, you're not going to lose points for lateness. So please turn stuff in you haven't already done, including the quizzes, including initial stuff for the assignment. Alrighty, so folks who have just signed on Zoom, please feel free to join the Kahoot as we go through. Great to see y'all joining. And this one is the premise is you are the psychologist. And so we are going to look at some case studies, basically, and then you're going to diagnose the people. So. And I have the music really quiet because I do not like the Kahoot music. All right, so I'll read this aloud. Zelda is extremely concerned with cleanliness. In fact, before she retires at night, goes to sleep, she goes through a cleaning ritual of her clothes and body that sometimes lasts for up to 2 hours. If she misses a step, she starts the ritual all over again. And I'm going to move the captions because they were over the answers. Alrighty, so yeah, OCD was the correct answer there. And it'll give y'all points for how fast you answered, and we will keep going through here. Those will change as we go through. All right, so the next one, Luke. For the last 7 months, Luke has been worried something bad is going to happen. He can't pinpoint the source of his feeling, but he's jumpy, irritable, can't sleep, and can't concentrate. Alrighty, yep, GAD. Some people had panic. Yeah, I mean, the anxiety does seem like it, but when it's like this where you can't pinpoint where it's coming from, it's not like in the moment freaking out, then it's generalized anxiety disorder. Ooh, got some changes on the board. All right, next one here, we've got Juan Carlos. When he was 16 years old, he was in a car accident. He was seriously injured. His father was left permanently paralyzed. 5 years later, he's trouble sleeping. He has nightmares. Sometimes when he's sitting in his college classroom, he thinks about the accident, almost reliving it. He can't bring himself to go to the street where the accident happened. Yeah, everybody got that one. PTSD. And that's what we'll go over next in terms of the details, but looks like y'all have read your chapters already, so you're good there. Awesome. Love to see the changing up. Everybody's doing great. All right, so Terry is having lightheadedness, rapid breathing, dizziness, especially when he tries to leave his house. And he leaves his house less and less. He only goes to the grocery store with his sister, and then he immediately is checking for exits. This one's a little trickier. Yeah, so this one is agoraphobia, that like being afraid to leave your house is a little bit different than being anxious other people will judge you. So yeah, that one was tricky, but that's okay. That's why we do this now, way before y'all would have an exam on it. And you're not being like graded on this, you're just getting points for participating today. So alrighty. So now we have Dora. Dora is having trouble breathing. Her heart starts pounding. She feels weak and dizzy. She feels like she's having a heart attack and is afraid she's going to die, but she's not really having a heart attack. Yep, everybody got that one. Panic disorder. Yep, so she is having a panic attack. Alrighty. Ooh, flipping around some more. Love this. Okay. So what disorder does Jada have? Jada's father died 2 years ago, but she can't seem to move forward. Having a hard time sleeping and concentrating. She doesn't have an appetite, so she's lost weight. She sometimes even just cries in the bathroom. Yep, most people got that one. She's got major depressive disorder. Really interesting side note with major depressive disorder I did not bring up when we were discussing the criteria is that it used to be you had to wait, I believe, 6 months after a loss in someone's family before you could diagnose them. Now you can diagnose them sooner. Some people worry that that pathologizes grief, but other people say that allows people to access care sooner. You know, they don't have to wait 6 months to get into therapy. Ready? Okay, so we're gonna have 2 more. So now we have Terrence. And Terrence for 4 years has felt down nearly every day. He's barely ever able to concentrate and just thinks that he's a loser. Alrighty, yeah, a lot of folks got this one. Persistent depressive disorder. This is that low grade, you just feel depressed, but never quite having that full depressive episode. So again, a mood disorder here. And this is our last one. Alrighty, so this person feels so low and unhappy, they're not leaving their room for 6 weeks. 2 months later, they have so much energy that they stay up for days without sleep. They think they're going to be the next president. They were banned from Kroger because they got in a fight with the store clerk. And he switches pretty quickly. Yeah, so this one is bipolar 1. If you're like so irritable or elevated when you are manic that you're like getting into fights with people, you would be probably needing to be hospitalized, right? All right, so we'll see our podium here. Everybody did great. I love that you all were participating. I appreciate that. Alrighty, good job, everybody. An excellent job to all of our participants. Like I said, I really appreciate it. I know that some people think Kahoots are cheesy, but it's just a nice way to like get a little vibe for things. There we go. Yes, we want to leave. There we go. Okay. So now, like I said, we're going to dive into our lecture a little more here. Sorry, I just remembered. I have to stop share in order to hide the captions. I have to get used to this new version of Zoom. So we're going to be talking in particular about PTSD to start, and then we'll get into some of the other disorders as well. Go ahead and put this in slideshow for everybody. There we go. All right, so post-traumatic stress disorder falls now in this category of psychological stress disorders. So after trauma or very stressful situations, people may become highly anxious and also depressed. And for some, those feelings will persist long after the traumatic experience. In order to be diagnosed with PTSD in particular, there has to be actual or threatened injury to self or others. And the criteria, like very specifically, talks not only about death, but also things like serious injury and sexual violence. So in terms of PTSD, there is a shorter term version of PTSD called acute stress disorder. And this is when symptoms begin within 4 weeks of the event and they last for less than a month. So folks sometimes develop acute stress disorder right after the event, and then will go on to develop PTSD and be diagnosed with PTSD. Some people will have acute stress disorder. It'll be really distressing for 2-3 weeks, and then it sort of resolves and they're good and they don't have these symptoms at all. With PTSD, symptoms can begin at any time following the event, but have to last at least a month. And so your PTSD could start directly after the event, or it may start months or years later. I was at the VA from 2009 to 2010. At that time, we had Vietnam vets, so folks from the late 60s, early 70s, who were coming in for the first time to be diagnosed with PTSD. For many of them, unfortunately, they had been self-medicating with alcohol for years and years and years. And then when they got clean, their symptoms of PTSD came out. And so this is the checklist for these disorders. An acute stress disorder has most of the same symptoms, again, just for a shorter duration. But these are the criteria explicitly for post-traumatic stress disorder. So exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. So directly experiencing it, witnessing it happen to someone else in person. So for example, a combat soldier, might not be, like, they might be in a safe spot, but they watch one of their comrades die, right? And learning that traumatic events occurred to a close family member or close friend, something that was violent or accidental, that can give you PTSD. And then experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of traumatic events. If it is work-related specifically, it can include exposure through electronic media, TV, things along those lines. So for example, when I was at the VA, I had a vet I was working with who his assignment in Iraq had been to monitor like helmet cams of all the other soldiers around Iraq. And so he was watching marketplace explosions, battles, things like that, just constantly. And it wasn't like he could turn it off because it was his job. So that would qualify here. And then you've got to have the presence of one or more of the following intrusive symptoms. And these are associated with the trauma and begin after the trauma occurred. So recurrent involuntary and intrusive distressing memories. Recurring distressing dreams, nightmares, right? Let's be honest, nightmares related to the trauma. Dissociative reactions, flashbacks, in which the individual feels or acts as if the trauma was recurring. Intense or prolonged psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that remind you of the trauma. Examples here, some of my vets I worked with didn't like going to the beach because the smell of sand would trigger their PTSD. I had survivors of sexual violence I worked with who would be engaging in consensual sex and something would remind them of their trauma and they would have a flashback. And then marked physiological reactions to reminders of the trauma. These can be like a panic attack, but they also can just be sort of like shutting down. Persistence avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma, again, beginning after the traumatic event, as evidenced by one or both of the following: avoidance of distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about the trauma, and or avoidance of external reminders that arouse distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about the trauma. So this might be people, places, activities, situations, conversations. I had veterans who would avoid going grocery shopping or going to Walmart unless it was the middle of the night, because just like going around a corner and seeing a lot of people could trigger memories of like seeing a marketplace attack. Negative alterations in cognitions and mood associated with the trauma, again, beginning or worsening after the trauma. And these include inability to remember important aspects of the trauma. Our brain actually does this on purpose to try to protect us. Persistent negative beliefs or expectations about yourself, others, and the world around you. Persistent distorted cognitions, thoughts about the cause or consequences of the trauma that lead the individual to blame themselves or sometimes others. Persistent and negative emotional states, fear, horror, anger, guilt, shame. Anhedonia, which means just not enjoying activities you typically enjoyed. Feelings of detachment or estrangement from other people. And then a persistent inability to experience positive emotions. So it's not just you're experiencing a lot of negative emotions, you actually have a really hard time experiencing positive emotions. And then there's marked changes in arousal and reactivity associated with the trauma, beginning or worsening after the trauma. And you need two or more of the following: irritable behavior and angry outbursts, reckless or self-destructive behavior. Hypervigilance is always being on guard, always kind of looking around you, expecting something bad to happen. Exaggerated startle response is if someone did manage to sneak up on you, tap your shoulder, you jump a mile. Another example of this is a friend of mine saw a vet who his child woke him up in the middle of the night. Something in his mind said this is an enemy combatant, and so he grabbed his kid by the throat. Kid was okay, he didn't actually hurt him. They had to do a lot of talking with the kid, like, we can't wake daddy up when he's sleeping, right? But that's an example of exaggerated startle reflex. Problems with concentration and sleep disturbance. This has to last at least a month, and there's obviously clinically significant distress or impairment. For some people with PTSD, this is just overwhelming, and they can sort of barely function. All right, so this is a video with people who have PTSD talking about what it's like to experience it.
It's like living with a leash on a little bit. You can do some stuff, but every now and then you remember that it's there.
I was living in Japan during the earthquake in 2011.
A few weeks and months of political unrest while I was living overseas. We lived with bags by the door ready to go in case we needed to get out.
I found out in 2008 I had PTSD, complex PTSD, but I think the diagnosis should have probably been made when I was 14 years old.
I was raped, and as a result, I live with PTSD.
The civil war in Lebanon broke out in 1975. I was only 17 years old. I lived through that for about 12 years.
As it kind of sunk in, I started to feel really guilty because I had always associated PTSD with people who had been to war, and I just didn't think I deserved it.
The PTSD triggers, they ambush you. You don't know when it's gonna come. It's sort of the unknown. Every day you wake up and you don't know if you're going to have a trigger today.
I was at a movie, and there's a part where this woman got trapped in a car. I had a serious panic attack.
There was a song that was talking about like shooting and armed robbery, and just hearing that song, that was all it took.
Something happened when I was 13, and when my trigger happens, in that moment, I am 13.
Usually the sounds of jet planes overhead would trigger off the memory for me of those days. It would make me feel weak in the legs, and my memory will go back to that time trying to look after my children when they were little and protect them. Yeah, all I had to do is hear a jet plane, and that's where my mind will go.
At times, it has literally felt like I'm dying. You feel like you're never gonna get past this. One of the things that's helped me a lot was group therapy. This happens to more people than you think.
Start to have a conversation with this thing that you have.
I did counseling for 2 years in college, and it felt like that got my life into a pretty manageable place.
I am trying to build up the courage to attend a support group.
I would have these days where you're just like, there's nothing I can do to do anything that you're supposed to do. In group therapy, someone called it a lost day. It's such a simple thing, but putting the words lost day to those days helped me overcome.
And I think accepting that is really important, and just being like, it's okay to freak out and just be like, oh, this is scary, because it's scary.
And don't ever tell them to get over it, because it's extremely painful.
It takes practice, and it takes patience, and it takes faith. You have to know that the fact that you've been through something so traumatic and you're here, you are much stronger than you think you are.
Don't feel guilty when you have a good day.
Give yourself time to heal.
You can't judge yourself for it.
It'll never be the same, but it can get better, and it's worth whatever it's gonna take. You can have a better life.
There is a light at the end of the tunnel. You just got to find the right thing that works for you.
And getting help is not a sign of weakness. It takes a lot of strength and a lot of courage, and you deserve the happiness that comes with getting better.
My name is Kate.
My name is Tammy.
My name is Kirk, and I live with PTSD.
And so I really like that particular video because it shows all different reasons people might get PTSD. Another common one that people don't talk about that much is bad automobile accidents. People will get PTSD, right? Things along those lines. So yeah, like they mentioned in the video, for a long time, people associated PTSD just with combat. But it can happen for any number of traumatic events, including like natural disasters, things along those lines. One of the things I really like in that video is their talk about triggers. So the word trigger and being triggered, right, has been like appropriated by our culture as being something weak or silly. But for people with PTSD, it has a very specific like diagnostic meaning. And it is things that will actually activate those type of flashbacks and other symptoms that they
It's-
talk about. So some stats here. The lifetime prevalence of experiencing at least one traumatic event is about half of women and about 60% of men. Approximately 7 to 9% of the general population meets the criteria for PTSD. More women than men develop PTSD. So after trauma, about 20% of women and 8% of men develop disorders. Again, I wonder how much of that is it being more socially acceptable for men to like develop a substance use disorder instead, which sounds horrible, but true. Some events like combat, disasters, abuse, and victimization are much more likely to cause PTSD than others. So in general, if you experience a trauma, about 8 to 10% of people who experience a trauma will develop PTSD, but certain types of traumas are going to make it much more difficult. So if you're wounded in combat, now that doubles. If you've been raped or sexually assaulted, half of people who have that happen develop PTSD. And if you notice, that's the exact same amount as people who've been prisoners of war, right? So that really speaks to just how violating that is. And people with repeated high levels of combat exposure, 60% of them have developed PTSD. We're going to talk about other forms of severe psychopathology now. So these are the disorders that we often see made into movies, things along those lines. And certainly these are things that are really interesting. But one of the things that I'm often concerned about is sort of the like using these for entertainment value, right? Or like romanticizing them. Schizophrenia is one of these. And schizophrenia stems from what's called psychosis. And psychosis is a state of being profoundly out of touch with reality. The ability to perceive and respond to the environment is significantly disturbed for folks experiencing psychosis. Now, one really important thing about psychosis that a lot of people don't realize is you can have psychosis for any number of reasons. If you just say someone is experiencing psychosis, it doesn't tell you any more than if I said this person has a fever, right? You know the person's sick, but you don't know why, right? You could have a fever because you have the flu, because you have mono, right? Because you have COVID, because you have pneumonia, right? A whole host of different things. So the ability to perceive and respond to the environment is very disturbed. Your functioning is impaired. It can be substance abuse. It can be caused by brain injury. It can happen in the context of a mood disorder. So for example, I saw a client with bipolar disorder who would only experience psychotic symptoms when she had a major depressive episode. And she would hear voices telling her to self-harm. They would tell her, like, put your arm in the oven and burn it. But she didn't experience them any other time. But again, a psychosis could also appear in the context of schizophrenia. And that's when we typically see it talked about, discussed. Symptoms include hallucinations, which are false sensory perceptions, abnormal sensory experiences that can happen in any of the 5 senses. The 2 most common are hearing or seeing non-existent things. And then delusions. And delusions are fixed, false, and often bizarre beliefs. So you might believe you're Napoleon Bonaparte, or that aliens are listening to your brain. And so again, as I just referred to, psychosis is this broad term referring to experiencing hallucinations and or delusions in any context. And then schizophrenia is a specific type of psychosis. Other things that have to be along with psychosis in order to experience or be diagnosed with schizophrenia include disturbed thoughts, language, and behavior. And both schizophrenia and psychosis are very varied. So they can present really differently from person to person, but still be the same diagnosis. So there are two types of symptoms in schizophrenia. There are these positive symptoms. This does not mean these are good symptoms. Instead, what this means is these are things the average person does not experience. So positive here means like added on to normal experience. Positive means pathological excesses, exaggerations, or distortions from normal functioning, or the presence of something that is normally absent. And these would include psychotic symptoms like delusions and hallucinations, but also things like the disorganized speech or behavior. Negative symptoms or type 2 symptoms are symptoms that represent pathological deficits. So they're the absence of things that the typical person experiences. So it's like you took something away from the average person's experience. These include things like lack of affect, loss of motivation, and sometimes in extreme cases, lack of speech. Some people with very severe schizophrenia will not be able to communicate. So the current diagnostic criteria include both of those. So these are the diagnostic criteria. You have to have 2 or more of the following symptoms. So the first is those delusions, those fixed false beliefs, someone believing they're the Messiah, things along those lines. The second is those hallucinations or inaccurate sensory perceptions. Hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there. I had a client I saw just for an intake, unfortunately, she never came back to actually get therapy. And she would see fire where there wasn't fire. It would look like her kitchen was burning down. Very disturbing, obviously. A disorganized speech, severe disruptions in the process of speech, where someone isn't able to articulate what they want to say or bring together coherent thoughts. Similarly, severe disruptions in the process of speech. You can also have grossly disorganized or catatonic behavior, and this includes bizarre or disrupted behavioral patterns. Some of these people just won't be able to care for themselves, so they'll always be disheveled. Sometimes they'll have completely inappropriate affect, like uncontrollable childlike silliness, extreme agitation, being unable to perform simple activities of daily living. And one thing that I'll point out is that, although as I'm listing disorganized speech and disorganized behavior here as positive symptoms, some people will actually argue that these 2 symptoms are their own category, the disorganized symptoms. However, as I said, they're usually lumped with the positive symptoms. And then the one that's not a positive symptom is those negative symptoms we just talked about: lack of emotion, lack of speech, lack of motivation. These could also include withdrawal or apathy. The negative symptoms of schizophrenia can look a lot like depression. And obviously their functioning is going to be impaired in work, interpersonal relations, or self-care. And it is markedly impaired. Unfortunately, a lot of these people can't live independently. The one case I saw long-term who had schizophrenia, she had been independently living. She was a teacher. And unfortunately, she had her psychotic break at work. And once she'd been through initial care, she just could not function on her own. So she actually, I think she was in her 30s, and had to move back in with her parents because she just couldn't care for herself. And lost her job as well. And you have to have signs of the disorder for at least 6 months in order to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. There are other diagnoses you can give someone before they get to the 6 months. You don't have to be like, come back in 6 months, person who can't function. And you have to have at least 1 month of symptoms in full and active form. So a lot of different things. And then one of the things I want you to notice is that you only need 2 or more of these, right? And so people with schizophrenia can look really different to one another, right? You could have your 2 symptoms be delusions and hallucinations, or you could have them be disorganized speech and negative symptoms, right? And so those people are going to look completely different in their presentation. So let's talk about delusions a little more. Again, I think sometimes it's really hard for people to like wrap their head around what on earth is a delusion? How does this work? So people will talk about the difference between bizarre and non-bizarre delusions, and that's sort of interesting to think about, right? Because if we just think about it using like lay terminology, they all seem bizarre to us. But the difference here is that bizarre delusions don't relate to ordinary life experiences, whereas non-bizarre potentially relate to ordinary life experiences. So an example of a bizarre delusion would be a secret race of aliens is controlling my actions with invisible rays from their home planet. Right, again, nothing grounding in reality. Whereas non-bizarre might be the CIA is following me. Right, even though the CIA is probably not following you, the CIA exists, we have evidence of it. I don't know, maybe aliens with rays exist, right? But we have no evidence of it as of yet. They're a bit more grounded in reality than non-bizarre ones. But it doesn't necessarily mean they're realistic. So delusions of persecution are the idea that you're being attacked, followed, and controlled. So both of those examples I just gave, the aliens and the CIA, would both be examples of delusions of persecution. Delusions of grandeur are beliefs that you are an especially important and powerful person, like believing you are God or an important historical figure. Delusions of reference are assumptions that external events are connected to you. So believing that the TV announcer is specifically talking to you, right? Giving you instructions. Delusions of sin are the belief that you're guilty for various sins you've committed when in fact you haven't done anything wrong to be guilty about. There's also hypochondriacal delusions, and these are a focus on illness to a pathological extent or a belief that things are contaminated. And then nihilistic delusions are the world is coming to an end. These are the people who walk around with the signs that are like, the end is near. In terms of hallucinations, as I mentioned before, these can be in any of the 5 senses. So auditory hallucinations involve hearing things that are not truly present in reality. So a client reported that the pipes in the ceiling were talking to him and he would talk back to the pipes, right? That's an auditory hallucination. Visual hallucinations, again, seeing things that aren't present. Sometimes you might see a loved one who is deceased, right? Something along those lines. Olfactory hallucinations are smelling things that aren't there. And I should say that like the olfactory and the next one, gustatory, are pretty rare. Gustatory is tasting things that aren't there. And then tactile hallucinations are feeling things that aren't present, right? So in addition to maybe like seeing a loved one, you might feel like they take your hand, or, you know, a more disturbing one, literally feeling like you have bugs crawling on you, something like that. As I mentioned, auditory and visual are the most common, and some people are incredibly terrified by these hallucinations, whereas other people might find them comforting and reassuring. Also, some people know that their hallucinations are not real. They know, like, this isn't really happening. Other people don't. To other people, these are truly going on, just like anything in the tactile real world. So they have a really hard time making a distinction between reality and their hallucinations. Disorganized speech are severe disruptions in the process of speaking or thinking. Loose associations is a sequence of logically disconnected thoughts. So the person will be talking about various things, but they won't go together to make a coherent thought. It could be really hard to follow what they're saying. The problem is insects. My brother used to collect insects. He's now a man, 5'10". You know, 10 is my favorite number. I also like to watch TV. Just like, whoa, we went through like 10 topics of conversation, right, in those like 3 sentences. Neologisms are really interesting. These are made up words, and the person doesn't realize they're using made up words. And so they'll say things like head vise for headache, or this desk is a cram style. He's an Easter horned head. And like, again, they won't necessarily realize they've made up these words, so they don't understand why other people don't understand them. Clang associations are nonsense sentences of rhyming of like-sounding words. I'm out, sprout, shout, shoot me, shoo me, shoo, shoo, fady, shady lady. How are you? Well, hell, it's well to tell. Right, and it's, again, they're not like purposely doing this, there's just something in their brain that like the rhyming has to happen. Echolalia is repeating verbatim what others say. So rather than being able to respond to what they're asked or what other people are saying, they will just repeat back. Echopraxia, then they repeat gestures, right? So like if someone with echopraxia was watching me lecture, I talk a lot with my hands, right? So they might, as I lectured, instead of being like writing notes or taking it in, they might be like copying my hand gestures. And again, it's not to make fun of me or anything like that. It's just like, that makes sense in their mind. That's what you do. Then you can get as extreme as word salad, where they will talk with like normal intonation. They'll have rise and fall of their voice. It'll sound like, if you don't pay attention to the words, they're making sentences. But then if you pay attention to the words, it's just completely nonsensical. Now, grossly disorganized behavior can be a wide variety of bizarre or disrupted behavioral patterns. So it can include things like dishevelment, agitation, childishness, but it can be also more severe, including catatonia, which is what you're seeing portrayed in this image on the slide. It's a psychomotor symptom that ranges from extreme immobility and unresponsiveness to extreme agitation. So catatonic immobility, people will just sit there and not move for hours. And it sometimes includes a symptom called waxy flexibility, in which a patient's limbs are held in a rigid posture for hours, again, like this person is doing. But if you're concerned about them and you think like, oh my gosh, this could be hurting their muscles, you can almost like bend them like a wax figure. I don't know if anybody had like Gumby as a child. He was a figure you could kind of like shape his arms and whatnot. You can do that with them. And so it's like their limbs are made of wax. Again, these are very, very extreme, rare, but can happen. All right, so the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. These are not as dramatic as the positive symptoms, but they're often more incapacitating in the long run because they rob people of some basic human attributes. So the one client with schizophrenia I saw, by the time she got to me for therapy, her psychotic symptoms were well controlled with medication, but what she was experiencing was the negative symptoms, and it was really, really hard to treat. So, affective or emotional flattening is the reduction or absence of experiencing negative, normal emotions, any emotions. They may appear to be emotionally blunted, or they may only be able to like show a very short range of emotions, or they can display affect that's inappropriate to the situation. So literally laughing at someone's funeral or crying out of sadness and something's happy. And again, they can't control this as part of the disorder. Alogia is minimal or absent verbal communication. Someone may be entirely mute or only give short, blunted responses to questions. Thought blocking is where they try to talk, but nothing comes out. So sometimes their mouth will even move, and then like just again, nothing's coming out. Avolition is reduced or absent motivation. Many people with schizophrenia find it difficult to complete tasks, even something that would be simple to most of us, like making a bed or going for a walk. They may sit all day and show little interest in planned or goal-directed behavior. And then anhedonia, which we've talked about with a couple different disorders, PTSD, depression. This is just a loss of sense of pleasure in doing activities you would normally enjoy. Other important diagnostic criteria here include the temporal criteria. Again, that idea that you have to have symptoms for at least 6 months. And then you have to have this significant impairment and or deteriorating in function over time in an individual's ability to function in their social or work environment. And people with schizophrenia do have significant work and relationship difficulties. 60 to 70% of people with this disorder never marry. And if they do marry, they have really high rates of divorce. Another indicator of their inability to function is what's called downward drift, which is that the socioeconomic status of people with schizophrenia is below that of their family of origin. So typically, people will do as well as their parents, if not better, in terms of the amount of money you make, careers, things like that. People with schizophrenia will be below that of their family of origin and their unaffected parents and siblings, and that's what's called downward drift. Yeah, I'll show at least part of this video. So this is CNN personality Anderson Cooper, and he is going to try a simulator that gives him what it's like to have auditory hallucinations, and he's going to sort of try to go out about his day
I'm
here.
gonna put these earphones in, and they're going to try to do a series of tests. Okay, so I'm now hearing sort of whispers and voices in my head, and the first test is on some number puzzles.
Listen, you suck
So you'll
and
hear
they
what he's
know
saying.
it. Can't you get this right?
Okay, so I did this test for 3 minutes, and I did not get a single one. It's very hard
And again, if you're not familiar with Anderson Cooper, he's very intelligent, right? So not being able to get any word or number puzzles right in 3 minutes is a lot.
to, it's hard to concentrate when, if it's like music or something constant, it's easy, but people talking to you is very difficult. So now I'm going to be asked a series of questions by our producer, Susan, and these are basically a series of questions that a person would be asked if they were being admitted to a hospital.
Can you tell me what day it is?
Yeah, it's Sunday, June, I don't know, what's the date, 7th?
So I'm going to say 5 numbers, and I want you to repeat them back to me after I'm done.
Okay.
5, 23, 67, 2, 76.
5, 23, 67, something 76.
I'm going to say 5 words. You don't have to repeat them, but just listen to them. Cat, book, cigar, damage, and rain.
make you okay?
Can you name the last 4 presidents of the United States?
Okay for you to be
Barack
here.
Obama, George
Come
Bush,
Here. Here. Right here.
Bill
Here.
Clinton, and George Bush.
Hear it? Hear
So
it
those
now?
5 words I said before, can you remember any of
Here.
them?
Here. Hear it.
No. It's hard when, because sometimes the voices are like whispering, and sometimes they're
You're
aggressive,
okay
and
now.
sometimes they're kind of comforting. And
Hear the tree.
but again, when people kind of
Skip
talking to you all the
ahead,
time.
because they had him walk around on the street, and again, just see what this would be like in day-to-day life for someone with schizophrenia.
Just come clear. Come near to me. Come near for help.
Hey, do you have yesterday's paper? Yesterday's New York Times? No? Okay, I'll just get today's. It's incredibly distracting on the street to have somebody talk in your head, and it makes you feel completely isolated from everyone else around you, and you don't want to engage in conversation with other people. You kind of find yourself wanting to engage in conversation with a voice in your head because they're constantly being really negative and talking to you, and everything they're saying relates to things that you're actually doing. They're criticizing.
And I think that that's so important because again, he had this experience for maybe an hour, right? And he already wanted to start talking back to the voices. So you can understand how someone who constantly heard these might talk back and therefore be perceived as crazy on the street. Alrighty, we will finish off disorders on Wednesday.